The notification arrived at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning in March. I was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched yet, watching the fog sit low over the garden when my phone vibrated once on the countertop. A single pulse. I didn't reach for it immediately. I already knew what it would say. I had been waiting 11 months for that exact notification, and now that it had come, I found I wanted one more quiet moment before everything changed. I picked it up. Hale and Webb Holdings Meridian quarter contract executed. Value confirmed, $347 million. I set the phone face down. I picked up my coffee. I took a sip. Upstairs, I could hear Vanessa moving around the bedroom, the soft drag of her suitcase being pulled from the wardrobe, the mechanical click of the combination lock being set, the wardrobe door closing. She was moving quickly, not with the scattered energy of someone in shock, but with the efficient, practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment privately and was now simply executing it. She had been packed in her mind for a long time before I gave her the reason to leave. I want to be precise about something because it matters to everything that follows. She did not know what was on my phone. She did not know about the $347 million. She did not know about Hale and Webb Holdings or the Meridian Quarter development or the 11 months of legal and architectural work that had led to that single notification. She knew what I had told her the night before over dinner, that our joint business account was being dissolved, that the consulting firm we'd registered together 6 years ago was winding down, that we were, in the most precise legal sense of the phrase, going bankrupt. She had not asked a single follow-up question. She had set down her fork, folded her napkin, and said quietly, "I need to think," and then she had gone upstairs. And now, at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, while a $347 million contract notification sat face down on my kitchen counter, I could hear my wife of 7 years packing her life into a suitcase with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had already done the maths and already knew her answer. I want to tell you something I have never said out loud before. I was not surprised. The truth, the one I had been carrying alone for the better part of a year, was this: the bankruptcy was a fiction. A precise, legally constructed fiction, but a fiction nonetheless. The joint consulting firm we'd run together was being dissolved, yes. Those accounts were being wound down, yes. But the reason they were being wound down was not failure. The reason they were being wound down was because every significant asset I owned had been quietly, methodically, legally moved months earlier into Hale and Webb Holdings, a private development company that existed entirely outside our joint financial life. Vanessa did not know about Hale and Webb. Her father did not know about Hale and Webb. Her brother Dominic, who had been sending messages in the family group chat for the better part of 3 years that I was not permitted to see but had seen anyway, did not know about Hale and Webb. Nobody knew except for my business partner Marcus Webb, my attorney, and the 47 people who had spent 11 months designing, negotiating, and finally executing the largest urban regeneration contract in this city's recent history. I had not hidden it out of malice. I want to be clear about that. I had hidden it because I had learned, slowly and then all at once, that the woman upstairs packing her suitcase had married a version of me that no longer existed and had been looking for the exit long before I gave her one. This is the story of how I found that out, and what I did with the knowledge, and what happened on a Friday evening in November in the private dining room of the Meridian Club when 11 months of silence finally ended. Beat 3, the channel break before we go further into Nathan's story, and I promise you it goes to places you are not expecting. I want to pause for just a moment and ask, where are you watching from tonight? It never stops being remarkable to us how far these stories travel. Drop your city or your country in the comments below. It always makes this feel less like broadcasting and more like a conversation. And if this story is landing the way we hope it is, if you can feel the weight of what Nathan was carrying in that kitchen, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel for more stories just like this one. It genuinely means everything to us. Now let's go back to Nathan, and the moment 7 years earlier when he first understood what kind of man he was going to have to become. I met Vanessa Calloway at a construction industry gala in the spring, 7 years before any of this. I was 31, she was 28. I was the lead architect on the Heron Street mixed-use development, the one that won the Regional Design Award that year, and she was there with her father, Richard Calloway, who ran Calloway Commercial Properties, one of the older mid-tier development firms in the city. She was the most compelling person I had ever been in a room with. That is not romantic hyperbole. I am an architect. I notice structure, and Vanessa had structure, the kind that takes years of careful self-construction to achieve. She was precise in her language, warm in exactly the right measure, funny without performing it. She asked me about the Heron Street project and actually listened to the answer, following the technical details with a sharpness that most people at those events didn't bother with. Her father watched us from across the room with an expression I could not then read and have since spent years interpreting. We were married 18 months later in the garden of the Calloway family estate. I want to be honest about what I believed going into that marriage because it is the thing that makes everything else hurt the way it does. I believed Vanessa and I were building something together. Not just a life in the surface sense, the house, the shared accounts, the social calendar, but something structural, a real foundation. I believed that when she looked at me, she saw what I saw when I looked at her, a person worth the work. For the first 3 years, I had no reason to doubt that. I had a successful practice. The Calloway family, initially reserved in the way of old money introduced to new ambition, had gradually warmed to me, or so I believed. Richard had even referred 2 smaller development projects my way. Vanessa's brother Dominic, 5 years younger and carrying enough inherited confidence for an entire family, had shaken my hand at the wedding with a grip that communicated something between welcome and assessment. I chose to read it as welcome. Our joint consulting firm, Hale Studio Partners, was doing well enough, not spectacularly. I want to be precise about this. By the standards of what I was building privately, what we ran together was modest. But it was real work, honest work, and I was proud of it. I was building something else at the same time. In the 4th year of our marriage, I partnered with Marcus Webb, a development finance specialist I had worked with on the Heron Street project, to form Hale and Webb Holdings. The concept was a long-cycle play: acquire distressed urban land, hold it, develop it with patience and precision. No shortcuts, no investors to answer to, just 2 people who understood that the best structures take time. I did not tell Vanessa about Hale and Webb Holdings immediately. This was not deception. It was, in the early stages, simply a private professional venture that hadn't yet become significant enough to announce. Marcus and I were working on a concept, not a company. It felt premature to make it a dinner table conversation. By the time it became significant enough to announce, I no longer trusted the room I would be announcing it in. I want to be careful here because there is a version of this story that turns Vanessa into a cartoon, a cold, calculating woman who married for money and revealed herself the moment the money appeared to leave. That is not the truth, and I will not tell it as the truth because I don't believe the truth is ever that clean. The truth is that in the early years, she was extraordinary. She had a quality I have only ever seen in a handful of people, which was the ability to make the person she was with feel fully seen, not performed at, not assessed, but genuinely witnessed. In the 2nd year of our marriage, when I lost the Queensberry project to a national firm with deeper connections and sat in the kitchen for an entire evening without speaking, Vanessa sat down across from me and did not say anything sympathetic or encouraging or strategic. She simply said, "Tell me what you saw when you first designed it. What did you see?" And I told her. And by the time I was done talking, the loss had become something different, not smaller, but more useful. She had the gift of reframing things without diminishing them. I had never met anyone else who could do that. I think about that evening sometimes in the context of everything that came after. I think about the specific distance between the woman who sat across from me in that kitchen asking what I had seen and the woman who told her father, 5 years later, that she thought she'd married a comfortable old chair. I think about what happened in that distance, not the events of it, but the erosion of it. The way a foundation doesn't fail all at once. The way it fails in layers, each one so gradual that by the time the damage is visible from the surface, the work underground has been going on for a very long time. I was not blameless in that erosion. I want to say that clearly. I worked too much and explained too little. I built things in silence because I am constitutionally a quiet builder, and the problem with being a quiet builder is that the people who love you can mistake the silence for the building being done. She stopped asking what I saw in projects, and I stopped offering, and the space that had once been filled with that particular kind of intimacy quietly became the space where the distance grew. I noticed. I chose repeatedly not to name it. That was my failure, and I carry it without excusing it. What I could not have anticipated, what no reasonable person constructs for themselves in advance, is that the woman who had once witnessed me so completely had been privately assessing me against a standard I was not permitted to know about. That the reframing she had always done so generously had, at some point, become something less generous. A decision about my ceiling, conducted in private, communicated to her father on a phone call she did not know I could hear. The moment I understood what kind of marriage I was actually in came on an unremarkable Wednesday evening in the autumn of our 5th year together. I had come home earlier than expected. A site visit had been canceled, a surveyor's illness, and I had driven home through the rain with the particular quiet pleasure of an unexpected free afternoon. I came in through the side door, left my coat in the utility room, and walked through to the kitchen. The house was still. Vanessa was upstairs, I assumed, from the faint sound of her voice. I poured a glass of water and was about to go up when something in the cadence of her voice stopped me. It was not the words, I couldn't hear the words yet, it was the register, flat, calculating, the voice she used in professional calls, not personal ones. I stood at the bottom of the stairs. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, Dad." A pause. "He's fine, he's perfectly fine, he's not what I thought he was going to be. He's good at his work, but it's not going anywhere, is it? It's not turning into anything, he's still taking these small projects. The Callaway connections haven't opened the doors I thought they would." I did not move. I know, I said I'd give it time. I have given it time. 5 years is time, Dad." Another pause, longer. "I'm not saying I'm leaving tomorrow. I'm saying I need to know there's a ceiling, because if I'm going to stay, I need to know what I'm staying for." I heard her father's voice then, thin and distant through the phone speaker, and I couldn't make out the words. But I heard her response. "A comfortable old chair, that's exactly it. Kind, predictable, safe. I thought I was marrying someone who would build something, and I think he might just be someone who designs other people's buildings." She laughed. Not a cruel laugh, that was the thing that made it precise as a scalpel rather than a blunt instrument. It was a tired laugh. The laugh of a woman who had arrived at a conclusion and found it disappointing rather than devastating. I walked back to the utility room. I put my coat back on. I got in my car and I drove for 47 minutes without a destination. When I came home, I was civil and warm, and I made pasta and we watched television, and Vanessa fell asleep on the sofa with her head on my shoulder, and I sat very still in the dark and I thought about foundations. About what they look like when they're real and what they look like when they've been painted to look real. I did not confront her. I did not tell Marcus. I did not change anything visible about my life. What I did was begin to understand, for the first time with complete clarity, what I was actually building Hale and Webb Holdings for. What followed was not a single event. It was a slow, considered, escalating education in what the Callaway family thought of me and what Vanessa, in their presence, was willing to let them say. The Callaway family Christmas was held, as always, at the estate. 12 people around a table that seated 14, the 2 empty chairs at the end, a kind of inheritance metaphor I had always found mildly funny. Richard Callaway sat at the head. He was 63 that year, silver-haired, with the physical authority of a man who had never once doubted that the room was arranged around him. The conversation had turned, as it often did, to development. Richard's firm had recently lost a bid on a city center mixed-use site to a larger national developer, and the room was performing the appropriate sympathy. "The problem," Richard said, refilling his wine without asking anyone else if they wanted more, "is that this city no longer understands what quality development actually costs. You have to be willing to invest at scale. Small operators, no offense, Nathan, simply don't have the leverage to compete." He looked at me when he said it, not unkindly. That was what made it precise. "No offense taken," I said. Dominic, who was 26 that year and running a small logistics operation on the back of his father's commercial connections, leaned back in his chair with the loose confidence of a man who has never had to build anything from nothing. "Small is fine, though. Someone has to do the small work." He smiled at me. I smiled back. Under the table, my right hand was inside my jacket pocket, and my thumb was running across the smooth, matte surface of the black Hale and Webb key card I carried everywhere that year. Its edges were sharp and clean. I pressed the corner of it into my thumb and felt nothing but clarity. The family group chat. I had not been added to the family group chat. I want to make that clear. I learned of its existence and its contents through a conversation Vanessa left open on her laptop while she was in the shower, a conversation she had forgotten to close when she came back to the room and found me sitting at the kitchen table in a position that gave me a direct sightline to the screen. She closed the laptop without speaking. I had seen enough. The thread was called, with the particular Callaway confidence I had come to know, Real Talk. Dominic's most recent message, sent 3 days earlier, read, Heard Hale lost the Fenwick Street pitch to Carter Associates. Must sting. At this rate he'll be designing bus shelters lol. Below it, a laughing emoji from Richard's account. Below that, from Vanessa, be nice. 2 words. Sent as best I could read from the distance, approximately 4 hours after the laughing emoji. I want to be fair about this. She said be nice. She did not laugh. I have thought about this distinction many times, and I have come to believe it is the most important distinction in the entire story, not because it exonerates her, but because it reveals the exact quality of her loyalty. It was not cruelty, it was absence. It was the loyalty of someone who shows up but does not stand. I pressed the key card in my pocket. I thought about the Meridian Quarter. I thought about the 340 acres of post-industrial land on the city's eastern fringe that Hale and Webb had been quietly optioning for 9 months. I thought about the $347 million contract that was, at that moment, in the final stages of legal execution. I said nothing. Richard Calloway took me to lunch at his club. I want to be very clear about the geography of this lunch because it matters. We were at a window table in the dining room of the Meridian Club. Yes, the same club, the same room, and Richard was in one of those expansive moods that I had learned to read as preparation for a speech. He ordered for both of us without consulting me. He refilled his own water before mine. He talked for 11 minutes about a development project his firm was pursuing in the north quarter of the city, a project I knew, from conversations with Marcus, was significantly underfunded and structurally unsound in its planning assumptions. Then he leaned forward and placed his hands flat on the white tablecloth and looked at me with the focused, compassionate expression of a man about to offer charity. Nathan, I want to speak frankly because I respect you. I waited. The consulting firm isn't going to become what you hoped it would become. I think you know that. You're talented, genuinely, but the market you're operating in is consolidating and boutique practices are going to struggle. I've been watching this for a while. He paused to allow me to confirm that he had been watching. I have a logistics coordinator position opening up in my northern operations. It's not glamorous work, but it's stable, good salary. Good benefits. It would give you a solid base while you figured out your next move. He said it the way you say something to a man you have decided is smaller than you, not with contempt, with patience. The patience of a man redistributing table scraps with one hand and expecting gratitude with the other. Logistics coordinator, I said. It's a real role, Nathan, nothing to be embarrassed about. Plenty of good people have started over. I looked at him across the white tablecloth. Through the window behind him, I could see the eastern skyline, a low, flat stretch of post-industrial roofline that, in 14 months, would be the Meridian Quarter development site. The largest urban regeneration project this city had seen in 30 years. 47 floors of mixed-use residential and commercial space, a public plaza, a cultural hub, my name on the architectural drawings. My company holding the majority development stake. I appreciate the offer, Richard, I said. I'll think about it. I put down my fork. I paid for lunch. I went to my car and I sat in the car park for 6 minutes and I thought about what it would feel like in roughly 11 months to invite Richard Calloway to a dinner at the Meridian Club, to a window table in that same dining room, and to let him spend the first 40 minutes of the evening believing that dinner was a farewell. Then I started the car. The Calloway family took a holiday in July, as they did every year, a villa in the south of France, 7 days, the kind of arrangement that requires a level of coordination that the family treated as evidence of their cohesion rather than their resources. I had attended twice before. That July, I declined. I told Vanessa I had a site visit that couldn't be moved, which was true, though not the reason I declined. The reason I declined was that I had calculated precisely what 7 days in a villa with Richard Calloway and Dominic Calloway would cost me in terms of the energy I needed for the Meridian Quarter's final legal phase, and the number was too high. Vanessa went without me. She sent photographs, the pool, the market, a sunset that looked like a painting. She texted warmly and regularly. I responded warmly and regularly. On the 4th evening, she called, and the call was easy and light and felt, in certain moments, like the early years. I sat in the Hale and Webb office after the call ended, and I held the feeling of it for a moment before I put it away, because I had learned by then that I could not afford to let the easy moments confuse me about the difficult pattern they existed within. What I learned of the holiday came later, from a single message in the Real Talk group chat that Vanessa showed me herself, inadvertently, in the way of a woman who had stopped worrying about what I might see, which was its own form of information. The message was from Dominic, sent on the last evening of the holiday. Good riddance to the absent architect. 7 days without a single mention of load-bearing walls. A new personal record, 3 laughing emojis below it from various family members. From Vanessa, nothing, not be nice, nothing. I looked at the message for a long time, not because it wounded me. I had passed the point at which Dominic's specific contempt could wound me some time ago, but because the absence of be nice felt different from its presence. Be nice was a small act, it was inadequate, but it was something. It was the minimum expression of a loyalty that was struggling to exist. Its absence felt like the minimum had been quietly discontinued. I pressed the key card in my pocket. I said nothing. The night I told Vanessa I had a major project in development, without naming it, without specifics, simply to offer something, some evidence that the walls she had been watching close in were not the whole picture. She looked at me across the bedroom with an expression I recognized from the phone call I had overheard 13 months earlier. Patient, tired Nathan, she said, I know you work hard, I'm not questioning that. I'm telling you something is coming, something is always coming. She turned back to her book. I just think it might be time we were honest about what coming means for us practically. I looked at the back of her head. I looked at the way she held her book, not reading it, just holding it, using it as the physical object that signified the conversation was over. I thought about a sentence I had once read in a structural engineering text about the difference between a hairline crack and a load-bearing failure. A hairline crack is a warning. A load-bearing failure is the thing the warning was trying to tell you. I had been reading warnings for 2 years. I turned off my bedside light. I lay in the dark. I thought about the Meridian Quarter. And I decided it was time to set the machinery in motion. The Hale and Webb Holdings office was not the kind of place you would mistake for significance if you didn't know what it was. It occupied the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian warehouse on the city's eastern edge. A building I had personally designed the interior adaptation for, which gave me a private satisfaction that I allowed myself once and then put away. The building's ground floor tenant was a catering supply company. The 2nd floor was storage. If you didn't have a reason to know about the 3rd floor, you had no reason to look up. Marcus had set up the access protocol himself. Black key card, biometric secondary on the inner door. The system was his idea. I had thought it was excessive until the point at which I understood that we were operating in a space where the difference between a leaked negotiation and a sealed one was worth 9 figures. I went there on the evening of the day I made my decision. A Thursday in late September, rain coming sideways off the river, the city doing its usual autumn impression of a place that had forgotten it was ever warm. I badged in. I took the stairs. I sat down at the main terminal. The Meridian Quarter dashboard loaded in 4 seconds. I had always admired its architecture. Marcus's analyst had built it clean, information-dense without being cluttered. The kind of interface that a certain type of person would recognize immediately as the product of serious, patient capital. Current asset valuation, $412 million. Hale and Webb ownership stake, 67%. Contract status, final execution pending, estimated 6 to 8 weeks. I scrolled through the project timeline, the architectural drawings I had produced over 18 months of late evenings. The planning approvals, the environmental assessments, the 3 rounds of negotiation with the city's regeneration authority. The financial model Marcus and his team had built and rebuilt 4 times until it was bulletproof. 340 acres, 47 floors at the residential tower, 11,000 square meters of commercial space, a public library, a performance venue, a park, my name on every drawing. My company holding 67%. I sat in that room for a long time. The city made its sounds below the window. The rain came and went. At some point Marcus texted, final clause signed off. We're locked. Waiting on the council's countersignature. Should be within the month, and I read it once and put the phone down on the desk next to my coffee. I thought about Richard Calloway offering me a logistics coordinator position. I thought about Dominic Calloway sending laughing emojis in a group chat called Real Talk. I thought about Vanessa, who had married a comfortable old chair, turning back to her book in the dark. I thought about the weight of the key card in my pocket and the length of time I had been carrying it. 11 months of morning coffee and humiliations and dinners I had sat through like a man waiting for a train that only he knew was coming. I opened a new document. I began to write. Marcus Webb had been my business partner for 4 years before any of this, but I want to tell you the specific thing about Marcus that matters, which is this. He was the only person in my professional life, in my entire life during those years, who looked at what I was building and responded with simple, complete belief. Not enthusiasm, not excitement, belief. There is a difference, and it is an architectural one. Enthusiasm is a surface quality. It responds to the glamour of an idea. Belief is structural. It holds when the glamour is gone and all that's left is the unglamorous work of making the thing real. Marcus was 51. He had the careful bearing of a man who had made serious money early and learned quickly that the real work was keeping it serious. He wore good suits badly, in the way of men who were too absorbed in the content of rooms to bother with appearances within them. He had known my grandfather, which I had learned 3 years into our partnership, and which told me something about why he'd said yes to the meridian concept when anyone with less history might have walked away from it. I called him on the Thursday evening after I had left the Hale and Webb office. "I'm going to tell Vanessa the firm is going bankrupt." A pause. "The joint firm?" "Yes, not Hale and Webb, no." Another pause, longer. "What are you expecting to happen?" "I'm expecting to find out what I already know." He was quiet for a long time. When Marcus Webb went quiet, it was never because he had nothing to say. It was because he was deciding how much of what he had to say was useful. "And after, I'd like you to arrange a private dinner at the Meridian Club, private dining room, a Friday evening once the contract is publicly announced. I want to invite the Callaways, all of them, all of them." I heard him breathe. "Nathan, this is a significant amount of architecture for what is, at its core, a personal situation." "Marcus," I said, "everything I've ever built has been personal." He was quiet again. "Then, I'll call the club in the morning, and Nathan, do yourself a favor, get some sleep. The contract's already won. The rest is just timing." "I know, do you?" I looked out of my car window at the rain on the river. "I'll sleep when the dinner's done." He made a sound that from Marcus was the closest thing to a laugh you were likely to get. "I'll have a leather folder made up," he said. "Something appropriate for the occasion. I'll be there at 7:15. I told Vanessa we were going bankrupt on a Thursday evening in November. Over dinner I had cooked myself lamb, which was her preference, with the particular care I had always brought to meals for her. I set the table properly. I poured wine. I told her at the natural pause between the main course and the point where the conversation would have turned to evening plans. I want to be specific about my phrasing because precision matters in architecture, and it mattered here. I did not say we are losing everything. I said, Hale Studio Partners is being dissolved. The joint accounts will be wound down. In the legal sense, we're going bankrupt. That was true. I then said, I know this isn't what either of us wanted. That was also true, though not in the sense she would have understood. She set down her fork. She folded her napkin. She said, I need to think. And she went upstairs. And the next morning at 6:47, while the $347 million notification sat face down on the counter, she packed her bags in 12 minutes and came downstairs with the clean, forward-facing energy of a woman executing a decision she had made long before it was necessary. She did not ask what we would do. She did not ask if there was a plan. She did not ask how I was. She put her suitcase by the door and looked at me across the kitchen and said, I think we both know this hasn't been working for a while. I looked at her. She was wearing the gray coat I had bought her for her birthday 3 years earlier. She looked composed and certain and genuinely, profoundly beautiful. And I thought about the woman who had stood in the Callaway family garden on a September afternoon and married me in front of 80 people and said words about foundations and the rest of our lives. And I thought about the phone call I had overheard in the stairwell, and I thought about a comfortable old chair. And I thought about the fact that the $347 million notification was sitting 3 feet from where she was standing, and she had absolutely no idea. I understand, I said. She looked momentarily surprised that I wasn't fighting it. I've arranged a dinner, I said. Friday evening, next week. The Meridian Club private dining room. I've invited your father and Dominic. I'd like you to be there. She frowned slightly. A dinner, now, consider it a closing formality. There are some things I'd like to say to your family in person, some things I think it's time to be honest about. She looked at me for a long moment. Fine, she said finally, I can do Friday. She picked up her suitcase. She opened the front door. She left without looking back. I stood in the kitchen in the silence she had left behind, and I thought about the word foundations. I thought about what it means to build something on ground that was never as solid as you believed. And I thought about the $347 million and the leather folder Marcus was having prepared. and the private dining room of the Meridian Club, where Richard Calloway had once offered me a logistics coordinator position across a white tablecloth while I looked at the land behind him that I already owned. I picked up my phone. I turned it face up, I read the notification again, I put it in my pocket, and I went to work. The Meridian Club on a Friday evening in November had the particular atmosphere of a room that takes its own significance seriously. Dark wood, candlelight, the low, considered murmur of people who had learned to perform ease in expensive rooms. The kind of place where the staff knew the names of the guests and the guests knew the names of the wines, and the whole arrangement operated like a mechanism that had been running so long it had forgotten it was mechanical. I arrived at 10 minutes past 7. I was wearing a charcoal suit I had owned for 4 years and had not worn since the last Calloway family event, which felt appropriate. No tie, no pocket square. Nothing that could be read as effort. I had learned from years of architectural presentations that the most powerful thing in a room is the man who appears to have nothing to prove. The maitre d' showed me through to the private dining room at the back of the club. They were already there. Richard Calloway sat at the far end of the table with the unconscious authority of a man who makes himself the head of every table he sits at, regardless of who booked it. He was in one of his club blazers, navy, gold buttons, and he had the particular expression of magnanimous patience he adopted when he was preparing to be gracious about something he privately found distasteful. Dominic sat to his father's right, arms slightly spread on the armrests, with the looseness of a man who had eaten at this club many times and considered that familiarity a kind of ownership. He was on his phone when I entered. He looked up, registered me, and put the phone away with a motion that communicated not warmth but the minimum social courtesy required. Vanessa sat across from her brother. She had worn something elegant and dark, the kind of outfit that works for both a social engagement and a departure, and she held a glass of white wine with both hands and watched me come in with an expression I could not fully read, which was unusual. Vanessa's expressions were usually legible to me. She had, in 7 years, become a language I thought I was fluent in. What I noticed, in the few seconds before I sat down, was that the three of them had clearly been talking before I arrived, and had stopped with the particular completeness of people who did not want the conversation's content visible. Dominic's posture held a residual animation that conversations recently ended often leave. Richard had the composed, forward-facing stillness of a man who has arrived at a prepared position. Only Vanessa seemed genuinely uncertain about what she was here for, her eyes moving between me and the door and the table with an uncharacteristic restlessness that I filed without comment. They had come expecting a surrender. They had dressed for a surrender. They had prepared remarks for a surrender, because the narrative they were all operating within, the narrative of the man who had never quite measured up, finally reaching the point of acknowledged failure, had a clear and inevitable endpoint, and they had come to witness it with the graciousness of people who understood how to be generous in victory. I understood this because I had spent 7 years learning how this particular family narrated the world, and I had spent 11 months designing an evening that would end their fluency in that narrative permanently. I sat at the head of the table. Richard gave me a look of mild surprise at this. The head was his natural territory, and then recovered with the practiced fluency of a man who would never give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him rattled by a seating arrangement. "Nathan," he said, "thank you for arranging this." His tone was the tone you use with a man you've decided to be patient with. "Thank you for coming," I said. "I appreciate it, all of you." I looked at Vanessa. She looked back. Dominic picked up the wine menu and examined it with his head tilted, performing consideration. "Drinks first," Richard said, "then we can get into whatever this is." He smiled at me. I smiled back. I reached into my inside jacket pocket and placed the Black Hale and Webb key card flat on the table in front of me. Nobody commented on it. I folded my hands and waited. At 7:15 exactly, the door to the private dining room opened, and Marcus Webb walked in with a flat leather portfolio tucked under one arm and the air of a man who was precisely where he had agreed to be at precisely the time he had agreed to be there. He set the portfolio on the side table. He sat down to my left. He looked at the Calloways with the quiet, measured assessment of a man who had been fully briefed. "Marcus Webb," I said, "my business partner." Richard frowned slightly. "I wasn't aware this was a business meeting." "It isn't," I said. "Not entirely, but there are some things I'd like to say to all of you, and Marcus is here because he can speak to some of the details more precisely than I can." Dominic put down the wine menu. Vanessa set her glass down. The room made a small, collective adjustment, the kind you feel rather than hear, and I understood that the temperature had shifted, and that Richard Calloway, who had not survived 40 years in commercial property without a functioning instinct for changing rooms, felt it too. I looked at the key card on the table. I looked at the three of them. "Let's start with the bankruptcy," I said. "The bankruptcy," I said, "is real. Hale Studio Partners, the joint consulting firm that Vanessa and I registered 6 years ago, is being formally dissolved. Its accounts are being wound down. I want to be completely transparent about that." Richard leaned back slightly in his chair. Dominic exchanged a brief look with his father. "However," I said, "I want to be equally transparent about something that I have not previously mentioned." I looked at Marcus. He opened the leather portfolio. He slid a document across the table toward Richard, then one toward Vanessa, then one toward Dominic. The documents were clean, single pages, clear type. The Hale and Webb Holdings letterhead at the top, a design I had commissioned myself, which was, I will admit, a private pleasure. "Hale and Webb Holdings," Richard said, reading. "My primary company," I said, "registered 4 years ago. I hold a 67% ownership stake. Marcus holds the remainder." Richard looked up from the document. "4 years," he said slowly. "4 years. And Vanessa didn't." "Vanessa was not informed, no." I looked at her. Her face was entirely still. "I want to address that directly, and I will. But first I'd like to go through some of what is in that document, because I think it provides useful context for this conversation." The room was completely quiet. The sounds of the club beyond the door, silverware, quiet conversation, the mechanical clock on the wall had not changed, but they felt very far away. "Hale and Webb Holdings has been developing a site on the eastern edge of the city for the past 2 years. A post-industrial site of approximately 340 acres, acquired in stages over 18 months. The project is called the Meridian Quarter. On Tuesday of this week, the development contract was formally executed." I paused. "The contract value is $347 million. Dominic made a sound, not a word, just a sound, the sound of a number landing in a room that wasn't prepared for it. Richard looked at the document in his hand. Then at me, then at the document again. His expression had changed, not collapsed. Richard Calloway was too controlled for that, but shifted. The magnanimous patience was gone. In its place was something more fundamental, recalculation. "I want to say something to you, Richard, that I have been carrying for a long time." I looked at him directly. "In April of last year, you took me to lunch at this club, at a table, I believe, just beyond that door. You told me that the consulting firm wasn't going to become what I hoped it would become. You told me that boutique practices were struggling, and then you offered me a role in your logistics operation." The room was perfectly still. "A logistics coordinator," I said. "Those were your words. You said, and I am quoting you precisely, 'It's a real role, Nathan, nothing to be embarrassed about. Plenty of good people have started over.'" Richard said nothing. "At the time I received that offer, Hale and Webb Holdings had already optioned the eastern site. Our financial projections had been completed. The architectural drawings were in their 3rd revision. We had a preliminary agreement with the city's regeneration authority. The project that would become the $347 million Meridian Quarter contract was already, in every substantive sense, underway." I let that sit. I said I would think about it. I thought about it. And what I thought was, this man does not know who he is speaking to, and I want to be precise about what I mean by that, because I do not mean it in the way of wounded pride. I mean it as an architectural observation. You had assessed the load-bearing capacity of a wall without knowing its internal structure. You were looking at the surface and mistaking it for the depth. I turned to Dominic. Dominic, to his credit, did not look away. "Dominic, in March of last year, you sent a message in the family group chat, the one called Real Talk, which I was not a member of, responding to news of a pitch I had lost to Carter Associates. The message read, 'Must sting. At this rate, he'll be designing bus shelters, lol.'" His jaw tightened. "Your father sent a laughing emoji in response." Richard's expression shifted. "I want to be honest with both of you about something. Those messages didn't wound me. I want to be very clear about that, not because I'm performing invulnerability, but because by the time I saw them, I was 14 months into the development of a project that would make the Carter Associates pitch look like a garden shed. The messages didn't wound me, they instructed me. They told me exactly what the people in this room believed about me, which made the architecture of this evening considerably easier to design." I looked at Marcus. He reached into the leather portfolio. He produced a second set of documents. These are the financial projections for the Meridian Quarter development over the first 5 years of operation. Marcus can walk through the detail, but the headline figure, the figure that represents Hale and Webb's 67% share of projected returns over that period, is here. I slid a copy to Richard. He looked at it. He said nothing for a very long time. The mechanical clock on the wall behind me marked the seconds. Outside the private dining room, the murmur of the club continued, silverware, poured water, the unhurried rhythm of people who had no idea what was happening on the other side of that door. I was aware of it in the way you become aware of ordinary sounds at extraordinary moments, their normalcy an almost absurd counterpoint to the specific, surgical quality of what was happening at our table. I want to tell you something else, Richard, something more personal. My voice was level. The room was absolutely still. You have spent 7 years treating me as a man whose ceiling you had already measured. You referred me small work not because you believed in me, but because it was easier than the alternative, which was to acknowledge that the man your daughter married might, in time, build something you couldn't contextualize within the framework you'd already decided he belonged to. You offered me a logistics coordinator position out of what I believe was genuine concern for your daughter, and I want to acknowledge that. But the concern was predicated on a fundamental misreading of who I am and what I was building. And I think, if you are honest with yourself, you knew something was being misread. I think the speed at which you've processed what I've shown you tonight tells me that. Richard put the document down. He did not speak. I am not angry at you, I said. I want to be clear about that. Anger would be a waste of structural energy. I am telling you this because I believe you are a man of genuine intelligence who made the specific error of confusing quietness with smallness. They are not the same thing, they have never been the same thing, and I think you know that now. I turned finally to Vanessa. She was very still. Vanessa, her eyes were bright but dry. She was holding herself with the particular composed quality she deployed in difficult moments, and I recognized it, and I felt something move through my chest that I want to be honest about. It was not triumph. It was not vindication. It was the particular sadness of a man looking at a person he had genuinely loved and understanding with perfect clarity that the love had been real and the foundation had not been. You said on a phone call to your father that I overheard 2 years ago that you had married a comfortable old chair. Kind, predictable, safe. You said you thought you were marrying someone who would build something. You said you thought he might just be someone who designs other people's buildings. The words were in the room. She did not look away. I have thought about those words many times. I want to be honest about that, not to punish you with them, but because I think honesty is the only thing that has any structural integrity left between us. I looked at her for a long moment. The Meridian Quarter's central public building, the cultural hub at the heart of the development, has been registered in the planning documents under an architectural designation. That designation and the name under which the hub will be publicly known when the development opens is the Callaway Cultural Center. I registered that name 14 months ago. It was intended to be a gift. I had hoped when I registered it that it would be received as one. She blinked. It still will be, I said, regardless of everything, because the person I was when I chose that name is still the person I am. And that person does not build on foundations that can be rewritten by what happens in this room. I stood. I picked up the black key card from the table. I held it for a moment, then I set it back down. Marcus will answer any questions you have about the financial detail. I'm going to give you some privacy. I walked to the door. I did not look back. What happened afterward came in stages, the way consequences always do when they are earned rather than manufactured. Not a single detonation, but a series of structural adjustments, the kind an architect recognizes as the downstream effect of load redistribution. Richard Callaway did not lose his company. I want to be honest about that because the story deserves accuracy. He was not ruined, but the announcement of the Meridian Quarter contract and the public disclosure of Hale and Webb Holdings' ownership stake restructured his standing in the commercial property community with a thoroughness that no public event could have achieved. The men who had treated his assessment of the market as authoritative recalibrated. The deference that had been extended to him for 20 years adjusted, not dramatically, but permanently. He was still Richard Callaway of Callaway Commercial Properties. He was simply no longer Richard Callaway, whose son-in-law needed a logistics coordinator position. He did not seek a meeting with me. I respected that. A man of genuine pride does not ask for the conversation that his pride prevented him from having when it mattered. He sent a message through his assistant 3 weeks after the Meridian Club dinner, requesting a professional meeting at a neutral venue. I declined politely via my own assistant, not out of cruelty, out of the clear understanding that there was no professional matter we needed to discuss and that a social meeting would require me to offer a grace I was not yet ready to give and did not want to perform. Dominic's consequences were his own architecture, and I will describe them in the spirit of fairness rather than satisfaction. His logistics business, which had been running largely on the credibility borrowed from his father's name, lost 2 of its 3 primary clients in the months following the Meridian announcement. This was not something I engineered. It was the natural result of his clients recalculating the value of Callaway adjacency in a landscape where the Callaways had just been publicly outgrown by someone they had dismissed. He moved his offices to a smaller building. He stopped sending messages in group chats. I have no desire to overstate what happened to Dominic. He was 29 years old when the Meridian contract was announced, and 29 is young enough that consequences still function as instruction rather than verdict. What I know of him since from mutual acquaintances in the industry suggests he has recalibrated in the quiet, unglamorous way that real recalibration requires. He has taken on smaller contracts with more genuine ownership. He no longer trades on the Callaway name as a primary credential. Whether he learned anything from the specific experience of having dismissed a man who turned out to be building something he couldn't have conceived of, I genuinely don't know. I hope he did. Contempt requires a certain confidence in the permanence of the hierarchy you're operating in, and I think the particular contempt Dominic had always deployed was an inheritance, learned rather than native. Inheritances can be returned. Vanessa moved into an apartment in the city. We filed for divorce through our respective solicitors with the minimum conflict available to 2 people who had, at their cores, always been civil with each other even when they were being something else. The settlement was handled by our attorneys and was, given what had emerged about the true scale of my assets, considerably more complex than either of us had anticipated. She received a settlement that was generous. I had instructed my attorney to be generous, because the alternative was a negotiation I was not willing to have, and because generosity in this specific instance was the only response that felt like the person I wanted to remain. She kept the gray coat, I kept the apartment. Marcus called me on the day the settlement was finalized and said, in the dry, understated way that was his particular register, "Well done." A difficult business but cleanly executed. I told him I wasn't sure that was the right frame for it. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "The right frame and the accurate one aren't always the same thing." Get some sleep. I got some sleep. The Meridian Quarter broke ground in the spring. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 7 months after the dinner. No return address. My name in her handwriting on the front, that particular forward-tilting script I had watched fill pages of notebooks for 7 years. I held the envelope for a while before I opened it. Nathan, I'm not writing to ask for anything. I want to be clear about that before you read another word. I am writing because I think I owe you something that can't be paid in settlements or legal documents or the ordinary courtesies of divorce, and the only form in which I know how to pay it is this. You were right, not about everything. I don't think either of us gets to be right about everything, and I think you'd agree with that, but you were right about the fundamental thing. I was looking at a surface. I had decided what the surface meant, and I held that decision longer than I should have, and I held it in ways that I am not proud of. I think I knew before that dinner that something was wrong with the picture I'd drawn of you. I think the Thursday evening when you told me the firm was being dissolved, the way you said it, the way you looked, I think I almost understood something in that moment. But understanding it would have required me to admit that I had been wrong for a long time, and I chose the suitcase instead. The Callaway Cultural Center. I stood outside the development site last week, looked at the planning boards, and saw the name. And I stood there for a long time. I am not writing to re-enter your life. I am writing because I want you to know that the person you were, the person who chose that name, that person was not a comfortable old chair. He was the most substantial person I have ever known. I was just too small for too long to be able to see the difference between weight-bearing and decoration. I hope the building is everything you designed it to be. Vanessa, I folded the letter. I put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, next to where the key card used to be. I stood at the window of my apartment and I looked out at the city, at the eastern skyline where the first structural steel of the Meridian Quarter Tower was beginning to rise against a gray November morning, and I thought about foundations. Not the romantic version of that word, the engineering version. A foundation is not glamorous work. It happens underground in dirt and water and conditions that the finished building above it will never have to acknowledge. Nobody photographs a foundation. Nobody names a building after the foundation. But everything that stands above it, every floor, every wall, every window and staircase and door, stands because of the work that was done below the surface in the quiet when nobody was watching. I thought about the years of that, the specific texture of building in silence while people around you assessed the surface and found it unremarkable. The weight of carrying knowledge that you cannot use yet because it is not yet time, and the discipline of understanding that the not yet time is not the same as never. I thought about Vanessa's letter and the 7 years before it and the specific, unsentimental truth that none of it had been wasted. Not the love, not the betrayal, not the long months of cold patience, because all of it had become material. All of it had been load-bearing in its way. The love was the most load-bearing of all. I want to say that because it is the thing the rest of the story might obscure. I loved Vanessa. I loved her the way you love a person whose particular quality of seeing you is so rare that you cannot quite believe it belongs to your life. The betrayal of that love, the discovery that the seeing had been conditional, did not retroactively empty the love of its content. That is not how love works, despite what simpler stories tell you. The love was real, its foundations were not. Those are two separate facts and they can coexist. What I took from the whole of it, from the phone call I wasn't meant to hear, from the 5 years of quiet accumulation, from the dinner and the letter and the months of rebuilding that followed, was something I have tried to articulate to myself with the precision of a person who believes in precision, and this is the closest I have come. The most dangerous assumption you can make about another person is that their silence is the same as their shallowness. The world is full of quiet builders, people constructing things below the surface that no one above the surface can see. And the world is equally full of people who look at those builders and see only the surface and make their assessments and act on them with the confidence of people who believe the visible is all there is. Richard Calloway made that assumption. Dominic Calloway made it louder. Vanessa made it privately, which was its own kind of betrayal, not because private thoughts are crimes, but because the private assumption quietly shaped the 7 years we spent together, and I was living inside those 7 years without access to the assumption that was shaping them. I hold no bitterness about any of it. I want to be honest about that, not as performance, not as the conclusion a story is supposed to reach, but as an actual, felt thing. Bitterness is a structural liability. It redistributes weight in ways that compromise the load-bearing elements. I have enough to build. I do not have enough to carry bitterness as well. The Meridian Quarter will open in 2 years. The Callaway Cultural Center will stand at its heart. On the day it opens, I will stand in it and look at the way the light moves through the atrium I designed, and I will feel the specific, quiet satisfaction of a man who built the thing that people said he couldn't build, and I will not think about the people who said it. I will think about the building. I didn't reply to the letter. I didn't delete it. I left it in my jacket pocket for a long time where I could feel its weight against my chest when I moved, and I went to work. The story of Nathan Hale is a story about a particular kind of strength that doesn't photograph well. The strength of a man who is building something that no one around him can see yet, who absorbs the weight of their disbelief not as an injury but as information, files it without sentiment, and keeps working. What the Callaway family saw was a surface, a quiet man, a modest practice, a comfortable old chair. What they could not see was the foundation, 11 months of legal architecture, of careful negotiation, of late evenings in a building no one knew about with a key card no one knew existed. They could not see it because he was not building it for them to see. He was building it because it was true. Because the most important structures are the ones that earn their weight through the work, not through the audience. We all face moments in our lives when the people who are supposed to know us best reveal that they've been looking at our surface. Those moments are painful in the specific way that structural failures are painful, not because of the violence of the collapse, but because of the quiet certainty that the damage was always there, waiting in the wall. There is a particular cruelty to being dismissed by someone who loves you or who believes they love you, because dismissal from a stranger is simply ignorance. Dismissal from someone who has had access to your real interior, who has sat with you at the table and slept beside you in the dark and asked, once, what you saw when you designed something, that dismissal is a different animal. It is a measurement taken with instruments the other person was trusted to use carefully and used carelessly instead. Nathan did not respond to that dismissal with rage. He did not respond with withdrawal or collapse. He responded the only way a genuine builder can respond, which is with the work itself. He let the work become the argument. He let the building become the answer. That is not a passive response. I want to be clear about that. There is nothing passive about the kind of patience Nathan exercised. Patience of that quality is an active discipline. It requires you to hold, simultaneously, the full weight of the humiliation and the full weight of the knowledge, and to let neither one distort your work. It requires you to sit at a dinner table with a man who offered you a logistics coordinator position and smile and say, "I'll think about it," and then go to your car and think for 6 minutes and then start the engine and drive back to the thing you're building, and keep building it and keep building it and keep building it until the building is real. The building is always the answer. That is the only thing Nathan's story told me that I think is worth carrying beyond it. What Nathan chose to do with that knowledge is, I think, the real story here. He did not perform anguish. He did not demand to be seen. He did not seek validation from people who had already decided he wasn't worth the effort of understanding. He chose instead to let the work speak in the only language that lasts. He built the thing. He let it stand. He let it speak. We want to ask you something, and we genuinely want to know your answer. When the people closest to you fail to see what you're building, when they assess your surface and mistake it for your depth, what do you do with that? Do you show them? Do you leave quietly? Or do you do what Nathan did and simply keep building until the building speaks for itself? Let us know in the comments. We read every one. And if this story landed the way we hoped it did, if it felt like something real, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. It means more than you know. Thank you for being here. The foundation holds.